Late on the evening of July 27th, 1977, a 21-year-old farmer named Huang Yan-cho walked down a wide dusty road in the little farming village of Beigao, located in northern China. It had been a very hard day on the rice farm where Huang worked because they were all preparing for the autumn harvest. But even though Huang was totally exhausted and worn down, as he walked down this road, he was whistling an upbeat tune. Because for the first time in a long time, Huang was actually excited about the future. Huang had grown up in a poor family, and he hadn't even finished elementary school. He still lived with his parents in a tiny house, and basically every day of his life was the same. He got up at sunrise, he walked to work, he worked all day until he barely could even stand, and then he would walk home and he would go to bed. But the reason Huang was now feeling kind of excited about his future was because he had just gotten engaged to a beautiful girl in a neighboring village, and their plan was to get married after the autumn harvest. Huang was already hard at work, literally building them a house that they could move into after they got married. And in fact, on this particular night, that was where Huang was going. He was going to the property where he was in the middle of building this house, and he was going there not to work on the house anymore, but really just to admire his property, because again, he was just so excited about the future. Huang turned the corner and his beautiful half-constructed home came into focus. The foundation, the walls, and the ceiling were all complete. All he had left to do was put in the windows and the doors. And so Huang walked up and ran his hand over the beautiful brick he'd laid around the outside of the property. Brick was not cheap. He had worked extra hours to afford this brick. And so he was just so proud of it, and he ran his hand over it. And then he kind of stepped back and kind of imagined the house when it was all done. And then when he felt satisfied that he had seen enough, he just kind of nodded and turned and just continued walking back towards his home, his parents' home, which was only a few minutes away. When Huang got to his home, he went inside, and his mom already had a meal made for him. It was just some rice and veggies. And so Huang sat down and began eating, and then his parents came over, and they began chatting. And then, of course, the conversation shifted to Huang's upcoming marriage, because that's basically all Huang ever wanted to talk about. And then by about 10 p.m., Huang was so tired that he crawled into his bed, and he fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, when Huang's parents woke up, they discovered that Huang was not in his bed. Now, this was not totally unusual because they knew their son was a really hard worker, and it wasn't unusual for him to wake up really, really early to head out to the farm to begin his workday. But a little while later, the workers at the rice farm where Huang worked, they saw Huang had not come to work, and because that was so out of character for him, one of the workers actually walked to Huang's parents' home to see if he was okay. And when Huang's mother found out her son had not shown up to work, she was really worried, but she told this worker, my son must have gone to the house he's building, go over there and see if he's there. But the worker from the rice farm went to Huang's property he was building, and nobody was there. And so when he came back and told Huang's mother, this sent her into a total panic, because really for her, this was like completely out of character for her son. He would never miss work. He would never just disappear like this. Something was wrong. So Huang's mother sent this rice farm worker to go find her husband and tell him what was going on with Huang. And then in the meantime, Huang's mother just walked outside and began going door to door, asking neighbors if they knew where her son was and if they wouldn't mind coming out and helping her look. Now, at this time, the village of Beigao was a relatively small place where all the residents more or less knew each other. And so it did not take long for the news of Huang being missing to spread all across Beigao, and the community really came out in force to go look for him. And so by the afternoon, there were people on bikes riding all around, calling out for Huang. People were going to neighboring villages to see if he was there. Another group of villagers went to Huang's fiance's home, and they spoke to her, and she had no idea where Huang was. And so by about the early afternoon, when so many people couldn't find any leads to where Huang had gone, it became clear that really nobody had a clue what happened to him. Now, Beigao at the time was incredibly isolated. This is a small town where most of the people who live there don't have phones, they don't have cars, they ride their bikes everywhere, and there were no roads that connected Beigao to any other place. Now, there was a paved road that went through Beigao, but it actually just came to an end on the outskirts of Beigao. So there was just no way to go to other places, at least not efficiently. Basically, if you lived in Beigao at the time, there was a finite number of places you could go. And all these people that had gone out looking for Huang had searched all of those places, and Huang just was not there. And they discovered his bike was still leaning up against his parents' house, and his work clothes, which he wore basically every single day, were still folded up neatly inside of his room. And so wherever Huang was, he was on foot and he was still in his pajamas. That night, Huang's parents would contact the village committee, which was basically like the governing body for Beigao, and the village committee decided that this was serious enough, because again, they're thinking, this is impossible, where is this guy, that they decided to contact the police. But when the police got this call, they did not launch an investigation right away because they had limited resources and there was no sign of foul play here. It was very weird that Huang was missing, but he was an adult, and if he wanted to go vanish somewhere, it was kind of like, okay, you're an adult, you can do that. And so Huang's family and the rest of the Beigao villagers were forced to just kind of wait and see if Huang came back. But over the next few days, Huang did not come back, and there was still no new information about what might have happened to him. Early on the morning of August 5th, so 8 days after Huang went missing, and still by this point there's no sign of him, the deputy director of the Beigao Village Committee came running up the road to Huang's parents' house and knocked on the door. When the door opened up, it was Huang's father, and the deputy director handed him a telegram he had just gotten and said, "Read it." And so Huang's father took the telegram and began reading it, and as he did, his eyes went wide, and then when he was done, he looked up and he was just so confused. The telegram had been sent 8 days earlier at around 9 a.m. on July 28th. So basically right around the time that Huang's family discovered Huang was missing was when this telegram was sent. But for whatever reason, the telegram had been very delayed, and so they were just receiving this telegram now, 8 days later. And the contents of this telegram made no sense. It said that just 9 hours after Huang had fallen asleep in his parents' home, he was discovered lying on the sidewalk in the middle of this bustling city called Nanjing, located 600 miles to the south of Beigao. Now, the reason Huang's father and the deputy director were so confused by this telegram was this was impossible. Remember, Huang does not have a car, so the only way he could get around was on foot or on his bike, and we know he left his bike by his house, so he's on foot and very likely in his pajamas. And what, he's gonna go 600 miles? I mean, even if he walked the 30 miles to the nearest train station, 9 hours, because that's how much time it took from falling asleep to being discovered in the city, is not enough time to go the remaining 570 miles to Nanjing. So Huang's father and the deputy director, they talked about this, and they both decided that, this just can't be true. Clearly, somebody has mistaken some other person for Huang, because he cannot possibly be all the way in Nanjing. Now, this telegram said that Huang was being held in a deportation center in Shanghai, and so Huang's father and the deputy director decided they would send a telegram back to the sender at this deportation center and tell them, hey, if this really is Huang, he should have a very specific birthmark on his wrist. And so when they sent this telegram off, they fully expected to get one back that said, oh, our mistake, it wasn't him. But they got a reply relatively quickly, and it said, oh yeah, he's got that exact birthmark. It's definitely Huang, but he's very confused. He doesn't really know what's going on. And so somebody from your village has to go get him. Huang arrived back home in the middle of August, so about 2 weeks after he had gone missing. And as soon as he got there, his fiance and his parents were so happy to see him. And pretty soon, a steady stream of friends and neighbors and other family members began coming to Huang's house to talk to him, to hear his story, to hear about what happened. But Huang really didn't understand what had happened to him. And so mostly he just didn't answer any questions he got asked. He just kind of kept his head down and just kept saying, I don't know what happened. And then really when his family pressed him and said, you gotta tell us, this is so crazy, what happened? He would say, look, I'm gonna tell you what happened, but I don't even know if I can believe the things I'm gonna tell you. And so Huang would say, all he could remember was he went to bed in his own bed in Beigao, And then the next morning he woke up and he was laying on the sidewalk, and when he opened his eyes, he saw there was this big swimming pool, and then near it was a sign that said Nanjing, and so that was how he put together that he was in Nanjing. And then almost immediately, these two police officers wearing all white just kind of appeared out of nowhere, and they walked up to Huang, they scooped him up, and without really saying anything to him, they brought him to that deportation center in Shanghai, which is a place where people who seem confused or mentally ill would be sent in order to help them get home. And that was it. That was Huang's entire story, that he just basically woke up in Nanjing with no idea how he got there. And so after he told his family, they all just kind of looked at him like, really? Like, that's what happened? That makes no sense. But Huang, I mean, he was completely lucid. He was explaining it really specifically and really simply. I mean, he looked and sounded exactly like he normally did, and he seemed very honest as he was telling the story. Over the next few weeks, Huang kind of reintegrated back into his life, but things just were not the same. People were now scared of him. I mean, kids literally ran away from him when they saw him because rumors were going around town that he himself, his body, was haunted or something. And so kids were scared of him, and other villagers would openly gossip about him right in front of him. I mean, even his beloved fiancée admitted to feeling really uncomfortable around him now. And while all of this was obviously very upsetting for Huang, he did also understand why people were acting this way. I mean, this is a very anomalous thing that's happened to him, and he did not have a good explanation for this totally insane event that he was a part of. And so he just kind of got it. And in fact, Huang himself was kind of terrified of himself. I mean, at night when he would go to bed, he would be terrified that the second he closed his eyes, he was going to be transported hundreds or thousands of miles away to some totally unknown place, and maybe this time he wouldn't even be able to get back again. But as the days wore on, Huang continued to wake up in his own bed in Beigao, which over time kind of made him feel more secure that whatever happened to him was a one-time thing and it's not going to happen again. However, Huang would be wrong. On September 8th, 1977, so 3 weeks after Huang had returned back home, he went to sleep in his bed in the village of Beigao, but when he woke up the next morning, he was not there. The first thing Huang noticed when he woke up that morning were the sounds around him were totally different. They were not right. Normally, when he was asleep in his home, he would hear the sound of his mother and father snoring right by him, and he might hear some insects or birds out his window. And those sounds were gone. Instead, he heard what sounded like footsteps, but not ordinary footsteps. They were footsteps of somebody walking on cement who was wearing high heels, like a clicking sound. And then Huang also became aware of the fact that his face was clearly pressed up against cement. He was laying on the ground, but Huang couldn't open his eyes. As hard as he tried, he couldn't do it. He couldn't move his body, and so he's just laying there on cement with his eyes closed, listening to the sound of these footsteps, these high heels, getting closer and closer and closer. And as they did, his anxiety was growing and growing. He had no idea who this person was. And then these footsteps, they got right up to him and then passed by him. And Huang felt the breeze as this person walked right past him. And then after this person in high heels had kind of walked off in the other direction, Huang finally was able to wrench open his eyes, and he sat up and he looked around, and one, he couldn't find anybody. It was totally abandoned all around him. So whoever had those high heels on had somehow vanished in plain sight. And then also, as Huang continued to look around him, it looked like he was in the middle of this city. But again, there's nobody out there. It's like this abandoned city street. All he had in front of him was this clock up on a building that said 1 a.m. And so pretty soon, Huang was just kind of walking in circles, screaming out for help. And right when he was about to just start sprinting in any one direction in hope that help would be somewhere out there, Huang felt a tap on his shoulder. And then the person tapping him from behind him said, "Are you Huang Yancho?" Huang spun around and he saw there were these two men in military uniforms standing there, and for a second, Huang felt relieved. Somebody was here to help him. But then he thought to himself, how do they know my name? What's going on here? And so he asked them, how do you know my name? But the two men didn't answer Huang. Instead, they told him that he was at a Shanghai railway station 700 miles from Beigao, and that they, these two soldiers, were here to take Huang to a nearby army base. At this point, Huang was so scared, he just didn't know what to do. So he just wound up going with these two soldiers who put him in the back of a Jeep. And then they hopped in and began driving, and they drove him out of this weird abandoned city where he had woken up. And after driving for some time, they arrived at this huge army base that had all these rows of fencing around it with razor wire on top and all these sentries that guarded all the doors. And these two soldiers brought him through several of these checkpoints. And then when they reached the very last one, they stopped the car, they got out, Huang got out too, and the two soldiers that were with him grabbed Huang's shoulders, and they basically led him through the last checkpoint, which was manned by armed guards. And as Huang was led through this gate, the armed guards seemed to not even notice the soldiers or Huang. It was like they were invisible to the armed guards. But either way, they got through the final checkpoint, and then the two soldiers that were carrying Huang led him to this kind of nondescript big building, and they opened up a door, and they began walking down this long hallway that kind of zigged and zagged. It was like a maze of different directions you could go. And then finally, they brought Huang right to this big door that said division headquarters over it. And then before Huang could say anything, one of the two soldiers that was with him knocked on the door. And then before anybody could respond, that same soldier reached down, opened it up, swung the door in, and then they pushed Huang inside, and they stepped in after him and shut the door behind them. In front of Huang was this big desk, and sitting behind this desk was a very senior-looking military official wearing a uniform. And this official, when they looked up and saw Huang standing there, they got up to their feet and put their hands on their gun and said, "What are you doing here? How'd you get in here?" And Huang, sensing there was something wrong, threw his hands up to show he was not a threat and pointed behind him and said, "They brought me here." And the military official, who still had his hand on his gun, looked behind Huang and said, "Who brought you here?" And Huang, he turned around and he saw the two soldiers who had picked him up and driven him here and led him to this room. They were gone, which was impossible because Huang would have heard them leave. He didn't hear anything. The door never opened. They just somehow were gone. A second later, the senior military official had pulled out his radio and he was screaming commands. And then another second later, armed soldiers came running into the room. They grabbed Huang, who still had his hands up. They came in, they arrested Huang, and they began asking him all these questions about how he got in here. How did you get through the guards? Did you climb the fence? Did you cut the fence? How did you get in here? It's not possible that you are here right now. But Huang did not have any answers. All he could say was, "The two soldiers, they brought me here." A couple of days later, Huang would be bussed back to Beigao, and again, his friends and family and everybody in town had all these questions about what happened, but again, Huang just had no answers. And then just 11 days after coming back home the second time, Huang would disappear again. And this time he would tell people he encountered two men who told him they were the same two men from the other two times he had gone missing. You had the first instance where he woke up and two police officers in white picked him up off the ground and brought him to the deportation center. And then the second time was the military base where you had those two soldiers who brought him through the gates and brought him to division headquarters. Basically, these two men he encountered on the third trip were saying they were the same men across all three instances. And on this third instance that he went missing, Huang said these two men put him on their backs and they flew him to 9 different cities around China for reasons unknown, and then they flew him back to Beigao and just dropped him off right outside his house near a tree, and that was it. Now, of course, this final disappearance sounds the most absurd because what, he was flying on the backs of people to all these different cities? That doesn't make any sense. But when Huang was kind of aggressively questioned about this third story, because it sounded the most made up as compared to the other two, it would turn out Huang had all this kind of insider information about each of the 9 cities that he supposedly was flown to by these two men. He knew the weather in each of those cities on the night that he was gone. He knew what shows were playing on the night he was gone. And he also just had really specific descriptions of where he was in each of these cities when they got there that all checked out. Now, you gotta remember that getting that information correct would have been really hard for Huang at the time. He did not have internet access, he didn't have a phone, he didn't have a car. I mean, he lives in an isolated small village in rural China. So the idea that literally the morning after all this happens, he's flown to these different cities, that he would have all this information perfectly correct, that's hard to do. That would be hard to lie about. As of today, no one has ever been able to debunk Huang's stories. Basically, there's enough legitimacy and verifiable information in his stories that you really can't discount them. They really could have happened. Add in the fact that Huang actually took a lie detector test and passed it, and suddenly you're looking at a story that, as crazy as it sounds, really could have happened. And so Huang's story today is considered far and away the most famous UFO story in China's history, because the leading theory here is that Huang must have been abducted by aliens, and that's how he was being moved around to all these places, and maybe those two men that kept showing up in each of these events were the extraterrestrials that had scooped him up. Nobody knows, but that is the theory. As for Huang, he wishes none of this had ever happened, because his disappearances and whatever happened to him basically wrecked his life. His fiancée broke up with him because she was so uncomfortable around him, and there was a lot of stigma around Huang, especially in the village where everybody thought he was a liar. And then on top of that, all these news and film and TV crews came to the village because they wanted to shoot shows and documentaries about Huang, and Huang did not want anything to do with them. But again, like, all these people are coming to the village for Huang, and it's making the rest of the villagers upset. And then also there was a really lengthy investigation by the police and by the military to try to figure out how in the world Huang got into that army base. I mean, there were layers and layers of security that he somehow got through, and all those armed guards that were watching the gates said they never saw Huang walk through, even though Huang said he literally just walked through the gate with the two soldiers that were carrying him through. And so today, Huang actually still lives in Beigao, and he had a son and a daughter, and he has grandkids, but he refuses to talk about what happened to him because, again, it wrecked his life. Miyoko Sumida raced down the sidewalk in Amagasaki, Japan, trying to will her body to go faster. Miyoko was 63 years old, and she couldn't remember the last time she had run, and her lungs were on fire, and her legs felt heavy. Even though it was a cool day out, she could feel the heavy eyeliner and mascara she always wore starting to run down her face. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to just stop, but she knew that whatever she did, she couldn't stop. She had already waited too long. Miyoko darted across the street and rounded a corner. Ahead of her, the city spread out. In the distance was Amagasaki Castle. It was a white 17th century building with these graceful layers of traditional Japanese curved roofs, and it stood in stark contrast to the rest of the city, which was all low, boxy apartment buildings and factories and warehouses. Miyoko turned a final corner, and there it was, the police station. She ran inside, and she called out for help. A police officer came out from behind a window, and in between breaths, Miyoko blurted out the reason she had come. One of her closest friends had gone missing. But the officer just stood there and stared at her calmly and told her to please slow down. And suddenly, Miyoko became aware of what she must look like. A little old frail lady with crazy hair, panting and gasping on the verge of tears. So she tried to steady herself and calm down and start from the beginning. In a shaky voice, Miyoko explained that her next-door neighbor had disappeared. Her neighbor's name was Kai Oe. She was in her 40s, and she was a wonderful, caring friend. But a few days ago, Kai had gotten into a strange car right outside her condominium, and nobody had seen her since. It was like she had vanished into thin air. And so Miyoko worried something terrible had happened to Kai, and now she wished she had come to the police sooner. The officer assured Miyoko that he would file a report and the police would look into this right away. But the officer also said that very likely there was a rational explanation here for why her friend had left. Miyoko began to breathe a bit easier. She told herself everything would be okay. The police would find Kai and bring her home. On November 9th, 2011, a week and a half after Miyoko reported Kai missing, a foreman and his work crew arrived at an old abandoned warehouse in the industrial section of Amagasaki. This warehouse was only a few miles from where Kai had last been seen, but the foreman and his crew didn't know anything about that. They just knew this was where the job they had been hired for was taking place. They were supposed to move some cargo that had been left inside the warehouse to a new location. When the foreman led the crew inside, they saw this vast, mostly empty space with trash and dust on the concrete floor and cobwebs on the walls. There were a few labeled crates scattered around, and so the foreman told his men to start moving them out to the truck. And as the crew took each item out, the foreman would mark it off his list. But then, at some point, one of the workers noticed something tucked away in a dark corner of the warehouse. The worker walked over to it and realized it was this big metal drum, like a barrel that might be used to store oil. At first, he just assumed it was part of the cargo they were supposed to move, so he grabbed it and tried to slide it across the floor. But the drum didn't budge. The worker laughed at himself. He was a pretty strong guy, and he figured he should be able to move a single metal drum on his own, so he took a breath, squatted down, gripped the top of the drum, and tried really hard to pull it out of the corner. But still, it didn't move. A couple of the other workers saw him doing this, and so they joined him in the corner. Together, they all gripped the metal drum and pulled. And it moved, but barely. At this point, the foreman came over to see if he could help, and when he did, he immediately noticed that this drum did not have any markings on it. And he thought that was very strange, because the other items they had come to move had all been very clearly labeled. And so the foreman glanced down at his list, and he did not see the metal drum anywhere on it. This sudden mystery got the crew excited, and they wondered what might be inside of this drum. Maybe there was something valuable or illegal. The foreman thought about just leaving the drum alone, but if it was a valuable item that somehow didn't make it onto this list but was required to be moved, well, the client would be angry if it was left behind. So the foreman told his crew to open the drum to see what was inside. Then they'd figure out what to do with it. The men were all in good spirits and joking with each other as they pulled on the lid, and the foreman could feel his heart beating faster with the anticipation of what they might find inside. Suddenly, the metal lid came loose, and it clanged to the floor. The foreman and his men leaned over the barrel to see what was inside. And for a second, there was absolute silence in the warehouse. As the foreman stared down into the drum, it was like everything around him disappeared. Finally, one of his men let out this awful, strangled scream, and it was like it snapped the foreman back into reality. He fumbled to dig his phone out of his pocket, and then with a shaking hand, he dialed 110, the emergency line for police. Not long after the foreman made that call, the lead investigator on the case, Officer Sato, walked into the warehouse along with dozens of police officers and forensic analysts. The foreman and his crew were still inside, but they had all moved as far away as they could from the drum. Officer Sato nodded at the men, but did not stop to talk to them. Instead, he headed straight for the drum in the corner of the room. And when he reached it and he peered inside, he gave a long, sad sigh. Inside the drum was the twisted body of a dead woman. And there was something else inside of that drum that also horrified Sato. Someone had poured cement inside the drum, and it had hardened and partially encased the woman's lower body. But he could still see enough of the victim to guess that she was probably in her 60s. She had gray hair and wrinkles. Sato could also see that she had bruising on her neck and face, she was completely naked, and she was shockingly thin, almost emaciated. As Sato stared down at the body, he felt his stomach turn. There was a true level of cruelty in the way this victim had been disposed of that hit him hard. But beyond his emotional reaction to this, Sato was also confused, because this scene didn't make sense. It was like his victim didn't match up with his crime scene. If the body of this woman had been found in her home, he could have at least started to wrap his mind around it, because approximately 1/3 of women who are murdered in Japan are killed by current or former intimate male partners. Most of those murders occur inside the home. But this didn't look anything like a domestic violence killing. In fact, Sato could only think of a few instances that involved covering up and abandoning a body like this, and all of those instances were connected to gang violence. In Japan, these gangs are referred to as yakuza, which is kind of like saying the mafia. Sato knew there were yakuza groups in the city. They typically engaged in financial crimes like extortion, smuggling, and prostitution. But there were occasional episodes of major violence, including murder. Still, yakuza violence typically occurred between different gang factions, not between gang members and normal everyday people. And Sato just couldn't imagine how the victim, this older woman, could have possibly gotten mixed up with the local gang. Sato called over a forensics officer. The forensics officer joined Sato and then stared down into the metal drum. He told Sato the bruising on the woman's face and neck suggested she had been beaten before she was killed. And her body had not decomposed much, which could indicate that she had been killed recently. However, they wouldn't know until the autopsy. Sato nodded and then stepped away from the drum and slowly walked around the warehouse, looking for more evidence. He didn't see any blood on the walls or floors, and there also weren't any rope fibers that would indicate the woman had been bound or held captive in the warehouse. In fact, other than the body, there really was no sign of any violence. But that lack of evidence actually helped Sato begin to form an early theory about what might have happened. He believed the victim was most likely murdered somewhere else, and then placed in the metal drum, and then transported and hidden in this warehouse. A few minutes later, Sato headed back to the police station. He knew he really needed the autopsy before his investigation would have a clear direction, because the autopsy would show him who the victim was. However, in the meantime, he decided that the way the body was disposed of was a decent enough lead to get started. The Yakuza had been known to leave their victims in metal drums, so he would start with them. The following day, members of Sato's investigative team fanned out to the dark corners of Amagasaki. So, back in the 1980s and 90s, and even into the early 2000s, the Yakuza had operated pretty openly in certain bars and restaurants. People could always tell the establishments where the Yakuza were running brothels, because there would be a scantily clad hostess at the door trying to entice customers to come inside, and then when those customers stepped through the door, the whole place would be lit with this strange bright pink light. And if they wanted to spend some money, they could go upstairs and pay for sex. But now, the Japanese police had begun a crackdown on Yakuza activities, passing a series of anti-gang laws and targeting different parts of their operations. And so, when Sato's team talked to people in the seediest bars and restaurants in town, they didn't really come up with anything. It seemed like the Yakuza were just laying low, not murdering women and stuffing their bodies into barrels. Sato began to worry that this Yakuza lead was just going to take his team to a dead end. But then, just a couple of days after the discovery of the body, the autopsy results arrived on Sato's desk. Now, the report couldn't answer when this woman had died. It was impossible to tell if she had been dead for days or months. However, the report did give the identity of the victim. Using dental records, authorities had identified her as Kazuko Oe, a 66-year-old woman who had lived in the city. Sato kept on reading the autopsy, and when he finished it, he found attached at the back was this additional report. And when he read this additional report, he was shocked. The report said the dead woman found in the barrel was the mother of Kai Oe, a woman who'd recently been reported missing. But that was not the craziest thing, because the missing woman, Kai, had not been missing at all. A few days after Kai's neighbor, an older woman named Miyoko Sumida, had filed a missing persons report, the police had tracked down Kai, just 20 minutes away in the major city of Osaka. And it would turn out Kai had been hiding out there using a fake name. Very suspicious. And so Sato quickly contacted the officers who'd found Kai, and they told him that when they'd located her, they had no idea her mother was dead. And so there was no connection drawn about perhaps Kai being involved in the death. And since it was not illegal for her to run away and hide out in a different city and pretend to be somebody else, Kai had simply been brought home and allowed to return to her normal life like nothing had happened. Now, Sato's mind began to race. He wondered if the case was really just this simple. Maybe it had nothing to do with the Yakuza. Maybe Kai had just murdered her own mother and then fled. Sato knew he would have to act fast, because Kai had already tried to escape once, and so he didn't want her to catch wind that he was looking for her, or she might try it again. So Sato quickly flagged down another investigator, and the two of them both ran out to Sato's car and sped through the city. When Officer Sato and the other investigator knocked on the front door of Kai's condominium, a short, nervous-looking man in his 40s greeted them. Now, the man was polite, but it seemed fairly obvious that he did not want them to come inside. The man told Sato that he and his family knew about how Kazuko had been found in the drum in the warehouse, and so they just wanted privacy to deal with their grief. But Sato told the man that he really needed to ask some questions, and they could either talk here, in his home, or the man and his family could come to the police station. The man turned around and scanned the apartment behind him like he was looking for something. Then he muttered something under his breath and turned back to Sato and said, "Okay, you can come inside." Sato and the other investigator paused to remove their shoes, then they followed the man into the front room. And Sato couldn't explain it, but right away, he felt like something was off here. He asked the man if he was related to the murder victim, Kazuko, and the man said yes, she was his mother-in-law. But then he quickly corrected himself and said actually she was his former mother-in-law. He was divorced from her daughter, but he still lived in the condo with his ex-wife, their kids, and Kazuko. This surprised Sato. Why would a divorced couple keep living together? But he just smiled and nodded. He wanted to keep the man talking very comfortably. And just because the living situation seemed odd to him, that didn't mean there was anything wrong with it. Eventually, Sato got to the point and asked the man if his ex-wife was Kai Oe, the woman who had gone missing and then returned. The man shook his head. He said he had been married to Kai's younger sister, but Kai actually also lived with them in the condo. The man paused and again looked around the room like he was searching for something. Then he turned back to Sato and just began to laugh. Sato glanced at the other investigator, and he looked as creeped out as Sato did. There was something so strange about this man, and it wasn't just that he clearly was very nervous. A lot of people get nervous talking to the police, so they were used to that. This weirdness was something else. Once the man stopped laughing, Sato asked him if Kai was home, and the man turned and pointed to a closed bedroom door. Sato got up and walked over to it, knocked, and announced he was a police officer and asked if he could come inside. There was a brief silence, and then Sato heard light footsteps from inside the room. And slowly, the door opened. And when Sato saw who opened the door, he had to consciously hide his shock, because the woman standing in front of him looked like a corpse. She was rail thin, and her eyes seemed hollowed out in her face. Sato could see there were stains on her shirt, and her hair was stringy and greasy, like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He asked her if she was Kai, and she just nodded. Sato stepped into the room, while the other investigator stayed back with the man. In the room, Sato saw there was a plate on the floor with scraps of food on it, and also clothes were piled up in different spots. The room smelled sort of musty, like the door hadn't been opened in a long time. Sato wondered when Kai had last left her bedroom. The silence was broken when Kai said she knew why he was there. She had actually been expecting the police ever since she got the news that her mother's body had been found in that warehouse. Sato asked if she knew what had happened to her mother, and in a voice so quiet that Sato had to lean in to hear her, Kai said, "My mother took her own life." This absolutely stunned Sato. If it was a lie, it was a really stupid one. Because why would Kai expect him to believe that her mother had, put herself into a concrete-filled drum? Or was she suggesting that her mother had killed herself, and then Kai, or maybe somebody else in her family, had then disposed of the body by putting it in the drum? Sato waited for Kai to say more, but she didn't. She just went quiet. Finally, when the silence between them had become deafening, Sato asked her, hey, why'd you run off to Osaka a couple of weeks earlier? Kai seemed to force a smile, and then said the whole thing was a big misunderstanding. She had just gone on a quick trip and was surprised anybody even noticed she was gone. Now, this made perhaps less sense than even the idea that Kai's mother had put herself in the drum, but Sato stayed quiet. He didn't want her to know that he was sort of onto her. He was a big believer in letting people trap themselves through their own words. But before Kai could say any more, Sato heard new voices outside the room, and he turned to see 3 people outside in the front room approaching his other investigator. Kai told Sato that the 3 people were her sister and her sister's young teenage daughters. Sato gestured to Kai to come with him, and then the 2 of them stepped out of her bedroom and headed towards the front room. Sato introduced himself to the rest of Kai's family and then shot another look at his partner like, what's going on here? The sister and the children looked as bad as Kai, like they hadn't eaten or slept in days. And when Sato asked them the same basic questions about Kazuko's death that he had asked Kai, he noticed their eyes dart back and forth like they were trying to communicate with each other without actually saying anything. And when they did speak, they all said the same thing, that Kazuko had taken her own life. Sato felt like this whole situation was just insane. He had arrived here thinking maybe Kai was involved in her mother's death, but now, after seeing Kai and her family and the unsettling way they were all living, he had no idea what was going on here. Why were they all so sickly? And why were they telling such transparent lies? Sato didn't know if these people were guilty or innocent, but he did know one thing for sure. They were hiding something. He told the family they would follow up soon, and then he and his partner stepped outside. And then once they were out there, Sato said to his partner that, hey, while we're here, we should speak to the neighbors to see if any of them have a clue about what is going on inside of that condo. They began knocking on doors, but the neighbors would just say they knew nothing and then quickly retreat back inside. Now, this actually was not surprising to Sato. In Japanese culture, people were often reluctant to speak about other families' lives, especially if that family was doing something illegal or if they were mourning the loss of a loved one. But Sato had hoped he would have at least one opportunity for a helpful interview with a neighbor. He had looked at the missing person report that had been filed about Kai, and he knew that the older woman who filed it, Miyoko Sumida, lived right next door. Now, the investigators had actually already knocked on her door, but she hadn't answered. However, Sato figured they should try one more time before they left. After all, she's the one who filed the missing persons report, and so if anybody had more insight on the family, it would be her. And this time, when they knocked on Miyoko's door again, she did answer. However, she just seemed really scared and quickly apologized and said she had nothing more to say. Sato and his partner were about to just give up and leave when a young couple opened up their door and actually invited the investigators inside. The couple told them that months earlier, they had been out walking in a nearby park when all of a sudden they heard a woman screaming. And when they looked in the direction of the scream, they saw Kai, her sister, and her brother-in-law and their daughters beating Kai's mother, Kazuko. They said they had immediately called the police, but when the police arrived, they barely questioned the family. Instead, the officers had a quiet conversation with the family, left after a few minutes, and never followed up with the couple. This didn't surprise Sato either. At this time in Japan, domestic conflicts were handled very differently than pretty much any other kind of criminal investigation. It came down to the same principle of respect for privacy that made Kei's neighbors refuse to talk to them. Basically, police thought that family problems, even nasty ones, should be dealt with by the family. Sato was disappointed he hadn't gotten more information, but as he and his partner left the young couple's home, his mind began to race. Kazuko had been beaten before she died. There was all that bruising on her neck. And now, Sato knew that Kazuko's own family had been beating her. However, this didn't solve the mystery. In fact, it only tangled it further. Because after seeing Kai and the others in that condo, Sato didn't think they could actually physically carry out all the steps of Kazuko's murder. Kai looked so weak that it seemed like she could barely stand on her 2 feet, and the rest of her family wasn't much better. So how could they beat Kazuko to death, then transport her body to the warehouse and cover it with cement? Sato could not answer those questions, and he didn't even know where to look. The next afternoon, Sato was at his desk trying to figure out his next step when his phone rang. He picked it up, and the man on the other end spoke barely above a whisper, and he said, "I have important information about Kazuko Oe's murder." Sato felt a rush of adrenaline, and instinctively he just stood up at his desk. He asked who the caller was, but the man wouldn't give a name, and Sato didn't want to scare him off, so he didn't press. The man said he didn't know how Kazuko had died, but he was certain that her family was under the thumb of a vicious Yakuza gang. And this particular gang had a ruthless leader, who was perhaps the most terrifying Yakuza leader in the whole city. After that, the caller hung up. Sato stood there in shock. It was like he had arrived back at the very beginning of this case, when he had stood over Kazuko's body in the metal drum and wondered if this was the work of the Yakuza. Sato immediately began a deep dive into the Oe family's finances. He knew that almost all Yakuza crime just came down to money. And right away, a series of financial transactions jumped out at him. Over the past 2 years, the family had made repeated big payments at regular intervals. And when investigators tracked the group receiving these payments, they discovered a connection to the Yakuza. So, Sato began to believe that Kazuko's family had somehow gotten into debt with the wrong people, and Kazuko had paid with her life. And on November 26, 2011, which was just over 2 weeks after the discovery of the body, Sato rounded up 5 known Yakuza members in the area and brought them in for questioning. However, Yakuza members rarely ever talked to the police, so after 5 mostly silent interviews, Sato had no clear evidence linking any of them to the murder. And he still had no idea who this gang's supposed ruthless leader was. So by the time that 2011 ended, Sato had hit another dead end. And soon months went by with no new evidence coming in. And so Sato began to think that he might never know who killed Kazuko. On October 14, 2012, so 11 months after the discovery of Kazuko's body, a pair of Amagasaki police officers approached an empty one-story house in a residential neighborhood. They were following up on an anonymous tip, very similar to the one that Sato had gotten. From the outside, the house looked like every other house on the block. But the second the officers opened the door, they knew something was very wrong with this place. The faint odor of something rotten filled the front room. The power was out, so the officers turned on their flashlights and headed down a dark hallway. The further they went into the house, the worse the smell got. Towards the back of the house, the officers found a room that was closed off by traditional Japanese sliding doors with wood frames covered in opaque paper. As they approached it, the rotten smell became almost unbearable. They braced themselves and then opened the sliding doors. Inside, they saw 6 large tatami mats made of thick woven straw covering the floor. Traditionally, shoes and socks would be removed before stepping on these mats, but the officers just quickly walked into the room, because they were sure that whatever they were looking for was somewhere inside of here. The rotten smell seemed to be coming from somewhere below them, so one of the officers crouched down, held his breath, grabbed the edge of the mat in the center of the room, and started to pull. And as the mat slid away, darkness opened up beneath it, and the officer shouted to his partner to come look. Under the mat, there was a hole in the floor, and when the officers peered down inside of it, what they saw made them want to run out of the room and vomit. Because at the bottom of that hole, partially encased in cement, were 3 naked, decomposing bodies. These officers quickly alerted Officer Sato, and it didn't take long for Sato to discover that these 3 new victims shared a common link with his original victim, Kazuko Oe. This link was a person who they were all very close to. It would turn out all 4 of these victims had been the victims of the Yakuza. There was a ruthless Yakuza leader who had overseen all of their murders. But Sato would soon learn that these murders were just the tip of the iceberg. This particular gang leader had overseen the murder of multiple entire families over the last 25 years. Based on evidence discovered at several crime scenes and from interviews conducted over the course of a year, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kazuko Oe. On the night of September 11th, 2011, 2 months before Kazuko's body would be found, the ruthless Yakuza leader reclined on a luxurious couch in a room filled with high-end furniture and artwork. The leader checked the time, and then picked up a phone and made a call. One of the killers answered, and without hesitating, the leader told the killer, "Now." Then the leader hung up, tossed the phone on the couch, and calmly waited. Not long after that, the 2 killers stood outside of Kazuko's bedroom, where she was fast asleep. After a minute, they signaled to each other that they were ready. Then they opened the door and rushed Kazuko's bed and leapt on top of her. Kazuko woke up to the sight of fists flying at her face, She tried to fight off the killers, but they had her pinned down, and each punch left her dazed and writhing in pain. She tried to cry out, but she was too weak. The killers brushed away Kazuko's arms as she tried desperately to protect herself, and they kept on pounding her in the face, the neck, and the head until Kazuko just stopped fighting back. When Kazuko went still and the killers realized she was dead, they climbed off the bed and backed out of the room. Back in the front room, one of the killers called the leader to say the job was done. But the leader just laughed and told the killers to stay right there, because the job was not, in fact, done. The killers did exactly what they were told. They always did exactly what they were told. They stood there in complete silence, waiting. Finally, the front door opened, and the ruthless Yakuza leader walked into the condominium. The killers led the leader into Kazuko's bedroom. The leader stared at Kazuko's body, and then barked for the killers to move her to the bathtub and cover her with ice. The killers obeyed. And once Kazuko's body lay under a blanket of ice, the leader brought the killers back to the front room. There, the leader told them to write a suicide note, and to make sure the note included Kazuko's last wishes, that Kazuko wanted to leave all of her money, her possessions, and property to the Yakuza leader. The leader then told the killers that the last thing they would have to do was secure a metal drum, so that other members of the gang could transport the drum with Kazuko's body inside to a warehouse. The killers nodded silently. Once the plan was set, the leader smiled at the killers and then turned around and walked back outside, and went right back next door to the condominium where they lived and went back to relaxing on the couch. The ruthless Yakuza leader, who had ordered the brutal murder of Kazuko Oe and who had presided for more than 2 decades over a secret and twisted reign of terror, was literally the last person Sato or anyone else had expected when this investigation began. Because the leader didn't look like some hardened criminal who could rule people through physical intimidation. Instead, she looked like a kind old woman. Her name was Miyoko Sumida. She was the 63-year-old woman who had rushed to the police to tell them that her neighbor, Kai Oe, had gone missing, and she was so upset about it. But to just call Miyoko a Yakuza leader would be a huge understatement. Miyoko was more like a serial killer and a cult leader. Over the course of their investigation, Sato and his team discovered that Miyoko's introduction to cruelty and brutality had come at a very young age. She grew up in Amagasaki during the chaos of post-World War II Japan, when the country was trying to recover from the devastation of the war. During that time, certain areas of the country bordered on lawlessness, and Miyoko's father had taken full advantage of that. Miyoko's father had been a very successful contractor who brought in North Korean laborers to work for him. He let those workers live in his home and eat his food, but he also beat those workers every day, took 40% of their wages, and threatened to kill them if they didn't do exactly as he asked. And so over time, out of fear and desperation, these men became completely obedient to Miyoko's father. And Miyoko had watched all of this very closely and even had begun to study her father's methods. Then, in her 20s, Miyoko herself entered into a life of crime, using a lot of what she had learned from her father. Her first major foray into the criminal world had been to buy one of those bars with the bright pink lights on the seedy side of the city that offered customers the opportunity to pay for sex. That had allowed Miyoko to meet members of the local Yakuzas and to familiarize herself with their tactics. When she was ready, she sold the bar and assembled a gang of her own. She recruited family, friends, and other people she trusted. Miyoko set out to get as much money and power as she possibly could, and using threats of violence from her gang played a role in her plans. But Miyoko went far beyond typical Yakuza violence to get what she wanted. Because just like her father, Miyoko understood that fear alone was not enough to own people. Her victims, they had to need her. In a way, Miyoko made her victims love her. To do this, she targeted families that owned property or businesses. She infiltrated those families by offering things like financial assistance to help their businesses grow. And at first, people viewed her as a generous benefactor, a kind, wealthy woman who just wanted to help others succeed. But once Miyoko gained a family's trust, She used what some might call mind control to gain power over them. She would start by turning members of the family against each other, causing problems in their house or in their business, and then blaming those problems on one specific family member. And through her financial assistance, Miyoko would start to make that family feel dependent on her to survive, just like her father had done with the laborers. And Miyoko would also use her money as a way to get family members to do favors for her. These favors started out small and got bigger over time. And slowly, the family would grow more and more obedient. And while all this was happening, Miyoko would start to make rules about when a family could eat, when they could sleep, who they could talk to, and when they could go outside. And if any of them pushed back, Miyoko would order her gang to inflict serious physical harm on them. So using these methods, Miyoko was able to completely break people down mentally and physically to the point where entire families were terrified of her and also simultaneously completely loyal to her. And it would turn out Miyoko had used these methods to infiltrate Kazuko's family. That's how she got Kazuko's own daughter, Kai, and other family members to publicly beat Kazuko, like that young couple had witnessed in the park. But Miyoko's demands did not stop with forced beatings. Her ultimate goal was to take everything that family had. Their money, their property, their assets, all of it. And for that to happen, Kazuko would have to die, and then give everything to Miyoko in her will. But Miyoko did not want blood on her own hands. This was the horrifying truth that Sato and his investigators discovered at the heart of this case. Miyoko and the members of her gang did not physically murder Kazuko. Instead, at Miyoko's command, Kai and her sister beat their own mother to death. In manipulating Kazuko's daughters into murdering her and then willing over all her assets, Miyoko had imposed her brutal will, like she had done without consequence for years. But what she hadn't counted on this time was Kai's reaction. Because Miyoko may have thought that she had Kai completely under her control, like she had everyone else, but she was wrong. A tiny part of who Kai was before Miyoko came into her life had survived. After Kai had murdered her own mother, she felt instant regret, and she couldn't contain it. Now, Miyoko had noticed Kai's emotional turmoil, and she knew it posed a risk to her. So, on October 30th, 2011, Miyoko had left Kai tied up and locked in a car alone, debating what she should do with her. But Kai had managed to escape, and that's when she fled to Osaka and began living under a different name. When Miyoko realized that Kai was gone, she ran to the police station and played the hysterical, desperate old woman just trying to find someone she loved. She knew the police would immediately believe her, and she was right. And when the police found Kai, she refused to tell them anything. Remember, she was terrified of Miyoko, but she was also guilty of her own mother's murder. How could she possibly explain her situation to the police? So she just came home. And so by the time Sato visited the OF family condo, Kai had been locked inside of her bedroom, starved, and was getting beaten by her own family ever since her return. And Kai almost certainly would have suffered the same fate as her mother if that work crew in the old abandoned warehouse hadn't gotten curious about the unmarked drum mixed in with the rest of their cargo. It would turn out that over the course of 25 years, Miyoko had infiltrated and destroyed at least 5 families, including the family that was found under the floor. And each time, Miyoko had manipulated members of those families to kill each other or to kill themselves. In the end, police charged Miyoko with 8 murders, but they were only able to recover 6 bodies. And there are a lot of people who believe that Miyoko has been involved in even more murders. Kai and her sister were ultimately treated as victims in Miyoko's crimes, and they were not charged in their mother's murder. In December of 2012, while in prison, Miyoko strangled herself with her own clothes and died in her cell. After her death, Miyoko would come to be known in Japan by names like the Killer Grandma, Piranha, and the Demon. But to this day, some people refuse to believe that Miyoko is actually dead. They argue that she simply used her powers of manipulation to fake her own death and escape from prison. On October 4th, 2017, a 61-year-old father of 6 named Tatike Katsai arrived at a hospital in Stellenbosch, which is one of the richest towns in South Africa. Tatike, who lived in the area with his family, had been dealing with some stomach issues over the last several months, and so this day he was finally going in to have abdominal surgery to hopefully alleviate those issues. So, after entering the building, Tatike was checked in, and then before long he was transferred to the operating room where surgeons got to work on him. After the surgery was over, Tatike was transferred to a recovery room in the hospital where he was scheduled to stay for at least a couple of days so the doctors and nurses could watch over him while he recovered and make sure there was no complications from the procedure. And so, on the afternoon of October 4th, Tatike just kind of lounged around inside of his recovery room. He couldn't really do anything because of the incisions on his stomach, and so he mostly just laid in his bed, he watched TV, he relaxed, he ate, and then at some point, some of his family members came into the hospital and they visited with him as well. By the end of that day, the day of his surgery, Tatike was definitely sore from the incisions, but overall, he was in good spirits, and to the medical staff, it seemed very likely that his surgery was a success. Early the next morning, at around 5:15 a.m., one of the nurses in the hospital went to Tatike's room to check on him. And when she went inside, Tatike was awake, he was alert, he seemed totally normal. And so after a brief conversation, the nurse told Tatike that she was just going to get him some fresh linens to make up his bed. And so Tatike nodded a thank you to her, and then the nurse, she turned away from Tatike, who's in his bed. She stepped out of the one door in the room into the hallway. She grabbed fresh linens off of a cart, and then she turned back around and went back into Tatike's room, except now Tatike was not in his bed. So the nurse immediately thought, okay, well then Tatike must have gone into his bathroom because the door was shut, he must be in the bathroom. And so, just kind of reflexively, the nurse walked over to Tatike's now empty bed and replaced the linens, and then when she was done, she just looked at the bathroom door inside of his room, expecting Tatike to come outside any minute. But after a couple of minutes passed and Tatike had still not come out of the bathroom, the nurse decided to go over and just knock. And so she walked over, she knocked on the bathroom door and just kind of called out, hey, is everything okay in there? But there was no answer. And so the nurse eventually just tried the handle, and when she saw it was open, she called out that she was coming inside, she opened up the bathroom door, and it was empty. And so the nurse, she whipped her head around and looked back out at the room where Tatike should have been, and she saw, he's not on the bed, he's not under the bed, he's not anywhere in this room. Where could he have possibly gone? And she's thinking to herself, the only door out of this room is into the hallway, the same door that she had used to go out and get the linens. And if somehow Tatike had ran out of that door in the few seconds that her back was turned from Tatike, she certainly would have heard him or seen him. Because again, she was right outside the door and only outside of his room for a couple of seconds. Not to mention the fact, Tatike has major incisions on his stomach and could barely stand, let alone walk or run. And so totally baffled, this nurse ultimately left the room and went and told her superiors. This hospital would immediately begin looking for Tatike on the grounds of the hospital, but they would do it kind of quietly. They wouldn't call Tatike's family to tell them that, hey, we can't find him, nor would they call police. And some have speculated that either one, the hospital did not think this was an emergency and they would quickly find Tatike and that everything would be fine, or two, the hospital was just so embarrassed at the idea that they lost a patient, they didn't want anyone to know, and so that's why they didn't tell anyone. Regardless, the hospital would search for Tatike all day on the 5th, the day he went missing, and they wouldn't find him. And then the next day, the 6th, the hospital again would spend the entire day quietly searching everywhere in the hospital, but they wouldn't find him again. And so finally on the next day, the 7th, so 48 hours after Tatike had just kind of vanished inside of his room, the hospital would reach out to Tatike's family and they would say to them, hey, is Tatike home with you guys? And the family was like, no, he's supposed to be with you. And so the hospital would say, well, he left 2 days ago, so we don't know where he is. And so Tatike's family is horrified, not only that they were totally left in the dark, but they would find out over the course of this conversation that the hospital had not even contacted the police yet. And so the family, they reached out to the police, and then later that day, the family would meet the police at the Stellenbosch hospital, and then a very public search of the property would ensue to look for Tatike. However, again, no one could find him. Authorities would continue to search both the hospital and also the neighboring area outside of the hospital over the next couple of days, but after they continued to find absolutely nothing, the search began to wind down. And so Tatike's devastated family was left with absolutely no idea what to think or what to do. Fast forward to October 20th, so 15 days after Tatike had gone missing. And on this day, the 20th, there was a construction crew at this hospital in Stellenbosch doing some renovations. And at some point on this day, one of the workers had to climb into the ceiling of one of the floors of this hospital. Now, the space above the ceiling is this tight, cramped space, almost like an attic. It's very big and wide. It's like the whole length of that floor. And really the only people that would ever go into the ceiling are construction workers or other authorized personnel that needed to do work. It's not a place that the public would ever go into. But when one of these workers went up into the ceiling, he had a headlamp on and he's kind of looking around. He's looking for what he needs to do up there. And at some point he turns his head and his light illuminates a person sitting in the corner far away from him, way up against the side in this tiny little attic space. And it would turn out it was Tatike, and he was deceased. The hospital had absolutely no clue how Tatike could have gotten up there. Not only is it obviously not a publicly accessible area, but the actual way to get up into the ceiling, the door that leads up into the ceiling, is very difficult to find. And even if Tatike found this entrance into the ceiling, it would have been nearly impossible for him to actually get into the ceiling. Because again, this guy has serious incisions on his stomach from the surgery he got. He could barely sit up. He couldn't really walk. So the idea of him climbing and pulling himself up into the ceiling just seems impossible. Then there was the very strange autopsy results. Now, the full report has not been made public, but Tatike's family had a consultation with the hospital after the autopsy was complete, and they would go to reporters and talk about what the hospital told them. And apparently, the hospital told the family that Tatike did not die from complications from his surgery, and they heavily insinuated that Tatike did not die from natural causes. Something happened to him, and the hospital had no idea what this something was, and that's what killed him. And the hospital also told the family that Tatike likely was dead before he went up into the ceiling. Meaning someone or something killed Tatike, and then someone or something placed him in the ceiling. Again, this is just from the family going to reporters and talking about their discussion with the hospital. The hospital's only official statement has basically been that they have cooperated with the family and they don't really know what happened to Tatike. Now, of course, this is a very strange story, but it gets even weirder. On May 10th, 2019, so about a year and a half after Tatike was found deceased in the Stellenbosch hospital ceiling, a 53-year-old father of 4 named Sandile Sibiya arrived at another hospital in South Africa. It was in a city called Durban, which is considered to be one of the nicest and wealthiest places in South Africa, similar to Stellenbosch. Sandile was a builder, and he had been working on a house when he had fallen and broken his leg. Specifically, he broke his femur bone, the bone that runs from your hip down to your knee, the big single bone in your thigh. So just for reference, if you break your femur, you can't walk. So, with some assistance from friends and family, Sandile hobbled his way into this hospital in Durban, and he began to receive care. 2 days later, on May 17th, Sandile was still in the hospital, still recovering from this broken femur, when his cousin came to visit him. The cousin said Sandile seemed totally normal, and that during this visit, Sandile told the cousin that after the cousin left, Sandile was going to be transported from this hospital to another hospital nearby, where he was going to get an x-ray of his leg, as well as talk to another orthopedic surgeon. But apparently, after this cousin left from this visit, the doctors at the Durban hospital walked into Sandile's room to take him and transport him to this other hospital, and Sandile was not in his room. Now, this hospital in Durban was known for their very tight security, and so right away, their reaction was very different than the Stellenbosch hospital's reaction. This hospital immediately contacted authorities and said, "We are missing a patient," and they began a very public search of their hospital for Sandile. But they couldn't find him. On May 18th, so 6 days after Sandil disappeared, the hospital in Durban began to smell this horrible stench coming from one wing of their hospital. And so hospital workers would track the stench to a janitor's closet, and when they opened it up, they saw this black liquid dripping out of the ceiling, and the liquid was coming from Sandil's decomposing body that was located in the ceiling. Sandil's autopsy would be carried out very quickly. However, the results of that autopsy have never been made public, and Sandil's family has not commented on the results of this autopsy. As of today, all we know is that within a 2-year period, 2 seemingly ordinary South African men, who both could either not walk at all or who could barely walk because of their physical injuries, somehow snuck out of their hospital rooms totally undetected by staff and then wound up dead in the hospital ceiling. Some say the men really did somehow sneak out of their own accord and decided to go into the ceiling, and that's what happened. Others say both men were murdered and then placed into the ceiling, and still others think these 2 cases are the best examples of something called spontaneous teleportation, which is the hypothetical phenomenon where a human suddenly disappears and then almost instantaneously reappears in another location. But for now, there is no official explanation, so those are all just theories. And so it's up to you to decide what you believe. Just after 6 p.m. on December 27th, 2015, a woman named Sarah Robinson was getting ready inside of her cabin on the 7th floor of a massive cruise ship. She and her boyfriend were going to dinner that night with Sarah's parents in one of the restaurants on board the ship. And in fact, this entire trip, this whole vacation, was actually a big gift from Sarah's parents to Sarah and her boyfriend. And so far, the trip had been totally amazing. I mean, all 4 of them, Sarah, her boyfriend, and Sarah's parents, had got to go swimming and drink great drinks and have great food, and it was just like a total dream. But now they only had 1 night left tonight, and they wanted to make the most of it. And their plan was to go to the big buffet that the ship offered and just totally indulge on the amazing food and just have some laughs, share stories, and then the next day they'd wake up in the Florida port that they left from, and the trip would be over. But for now, they had this 1 dinner left. And so after Sarah and her boyfriend were all ready, they left their cabin and they met Sarah's parents out in the hallway, and then Sarah led the way towards the stairwell that would bring them up to the 10th floor where the restaurant was that they were going to. Once they reached the 10th floor, Sarah could see right in front of her the entrance to this restaurant. And so she, her boyfriend, and her parents, all behind her, began walking towards the restaurant. And to get there, they would have to walk past this sort of lobby right in front of the restaurant, where there was this elevator bank that would go down to the lobby and all the other floors. And so, Sarah and her family, they walked past these elevators, and as they did, Sarah began to hear what sounded like rain hitting the outside of the ship. But that didn't make any sense because that whole day the weather had been beautiful and clear, and Sarah, when she heard this sound, she instinctively kind of looked around the corner out one of the windows, and she looked out into the night, and it was still clear and beautiful out, so this could not be rain. And so Sarah, she turned around and she looked at her boyfriend and her parents with a sort of quizzical look, being like, "Do you hear this? Like, what is that sound?" And they clearly had heard it too and were looking back at her like, "I don't know." But before they could even start to discuss whatever this was, a woman who they didn't know, who was standing near these elevators as well, began to scream. It would turn out just a few minutes before this woman began to scream, the cruise ship's chief electrician, 66-year-old Jose Sandoval Opazo, had begun doing routine maintenance on the elevators that were located a few floors below the 10th floor, but still within that same elevator bank that could bring you up to the 10th floor where that restaurant was. And while Jose was performing this very routine and quick maintenance on the elevator, something strange happened. But to understand why this happened, you need to understand a little bit about Jose and the other electricians on board this cruise ship. So there was oftentimes a lot of very quick and easy maintenance that would need to get done on these elevators, which would involve going into the elevator shaft to do it. But again, these are very short bursts, in and out, very easy to do. All the electricians know how to do it. And the procedure was to actually fully shut down that elevator, like completely, and then go inside and do the maintenance, and then go through the process of starting the elevator all over again. But that was so disruptive to the flow of traffic on the ship each day, and it was just kind of a hassle. And so Jose and the other electricians had come up with this sort of workaround that didn't require them to shut down the elevator, because again, that was just a huge pain and they didn't want to do it. And so what they would do is they would wait until the elevator car within the shaft they needed to do maintenance on was at some other level, like on floor 2, and they would go into the elevator on like floor 8 and then quickly do the maintenance on the inside of the shaft or whatever it is they had to do. Or sometimes they would actually have to do repairs on the elevator car itself, in which case they would just kind of go in real quick, do the repairs, get out again. But all of it was predicated on just kind of knowing where the elevator car was in the shaft and being really quick, in and out. And so Jose and the other electricians had done this many times and there was no issues. But on this day, Jose, he got into the elevator shaft to make these simple repairs. And so he actually was standing inside of the shaft on top of the elevator car that was down, a few levels down from 10. And he began making these repairs. And suddenly the car lurched into action because a guest unknowingly had walked into the elevator car and pressed floor 10. And so Jose is on this elevator car that starts moving, and before he can even figure out what's going on, the little opening that he used, the kind of service entrance into the shaft, had been covered up by the elevator car. And so his exit was now gone, and he was now relatively slowly moving up the shaft. Now, Jose would have no idea when this car was going to stop, but if it went to the top, he'd get crushed, and he knew it. And so in kind of a moment of panic, Jose attempted to step to the side to somehow go between the wall and the elevator. It was like he had nowhere to go and he knew it and he just took that path. But there was an inch of space between the wall and the car. And so the second he did that, the car kept going and it sucked him down into that space and just destroyed him. And so by the time this elevator car reached its destination, the 10th floor, and that guest got off the elevator car, by this point, Jose's body had been totally destroyed and all of his blood was dripping down the elevator shaft, splattering into the walls and hitting the ground, and it sounded like rain hitting the outside of the ship. And so that's what Sarah and her family were hearing. And then the reason that woman started screaming is she was the first one who turned and saw all this blood coming down the front of the elevator doors. Medics would arrive quickly on the scene, but there was nothing they could do. Jose was deceased. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Back in 2017, I was really struggling with my mental health. I had just left the military after almost a decade of service, and I was just really struggling to reintegrate into society, and it was making me totally depressed. Now, I had a great support system around me. I had my wife, my kids, my parents, my siblings, friends, but I had such dark thoughts and feelings. I just didn't feel comfortable sharing them with people I loved. I was worried it would kind of upset them, and they'd also view me differently in a negative way, which, by the way, this is a very common train of thought amongst people who are feeling depressed. So I didn't realize how common it was, but there you go. Lots of people feel this way, and I did too. However, even though I didn't tell my family or friends anything, they eventually picked up that something was wrong with me, and they actually approached me and said, look, I really think you need to see someone. I think you need to see a therapist. And honestly, I was ready for that help, and so I did seek out a therapist. And my goodness, unburdening myself of all that horrible darkness inside of me to a trained, neutral third party was so cathartic. And of course, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but if you're really struggling right now and you're kind of holding it all in, you really ought to give therapy a try. And a really easy entry into therapy is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your own home. All you have to do is fill out a short survey online, and then within about 48 hours, you get paired up with a licensed therapist, and then it's up to you how you communicate and how often. Also, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional cost. Let BetterHelp connect you with a therapist who can support you all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/MrBallen or select MrBallen during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. At around 2 p.m. on September 24th, 2017, a 17-year-old college student named Sanjay climbed up onto this boulder that was right off to the side of this hiking trail that he was on. Sanjay was on a day trip with about 20 of his friends from college, And they were in this part of southern India that was really famous for its long, winding trails and all these boulders that kind of sat off to the side of the trails. And then at the end of these trails that are in this part of India is this beautiful ancient Hindu temple that a lot of people will go and take pictures in front of and go inside of. And so that was where Sanjay and his friends were ultimately headed, was this temple. And from the boulder that Sanjay had just climbed up on, he looked up the trail, and from his view now, which was now slightly higher, he could actually see just barely the top of this temple. And so he was really excited about going to see it, and he couldn't believe how close they were. But as he was standing on this boulder, staring at the top of the temple, he also realized that kind of off to the side of the temple, basically right next to it, was this beautiful pool of water with a big wall around it and cement steps leading into it. I mean, it kind of looked like a swimming pool. And so because Sanjay and his friends had been hiking all day to this point, and it was really hot out, Sanjay really liked the idea of going swimming. And so he actually jumped off the boulder and just started running towards the temple and this pool. And he was yelling to his friends as he did, like, hey, I'm gonna go swimming. And so he ran, not to the temple, but to this random pool of water that was next to it. And he got to the steps and he immediately took off his shirt and he pulled his phone out of his pocket and he put it on the steps. And then he walked his way into the water and turned around, hoping to see his friends coming after him. And sure enough, all of his friends were smiling and laughing and running after him, ripping their shirts off, putting their phones down and jumping in too. And so pretty soon, this very quiet, peaceful pool next to this temple was packed full of very rowdy and crazy college kids. Now, to be clear, this pool of water was not intended to be a swimming area. It was dug about 300 years earlier for this temple, and many people began to view this pool of water as sacred because they believed it could cure diseases. And so what Sanjay and his friends were doing was totally taboo and not allowed. But I can promise you, Sanjay and his friends did not care. They were having a great time. And in fact, Sanjay was having such a great time that when he turned around and looked back up the steps they'd all charged in on, he saw one of his friends, whose name was Vishwas, was standing up out of the water reading what looked like a plaque about this pool of water. And Sanjay hated the idea of one of their buddies not getting to experience this fun. And so Sanjay, a little out of pocket, yelled out to Vishwas like, hey, stop reading that and get in the water. Let's go. What are you doing? And Vishwas was obviously kind of embarrassed to be called out so publicly in front of the, 19 other kids that were there. They're all looking up at him expectantly now, like, yeah, get in here, man. And Vishwas, he's like, okay, fine. And so he took off his shirt, put his phone down as well, and he got in the water with all of them. And very shortly after he did that, Sanjay kind of forgot about him and decided, hey, this would be a great time to take a photo of everybody here, memorialize this amazing trip. And so Sanjay, he waded over to the steps, he grabbed his phone, he came back towards the group, and he's looking at this big rowdy crowd of his friends who were totally not paying attention to him. And he's saying, hey guys, come over here. I want to take your photo, gather up, I'll take a photo of all of us. And so it took a couple of minutes, but eventually, all these kids got in frame, and Sanjay, he held the phone out, made sure everybody was there, and they all smiled, and he took a picture. And then after he took the picture, Sanjay put his phone back on the steps and returned to just splashing and goofing around with his friends. About an hour later, Sanjay and his friends had left the pool and were now in the temple and were just walking around exploring. But eventually, Sanjay just got tired of looking inside the temple. It was not very interesting to him. And so he eventually just went outside again and sat down on this low wall that was right outside the temple. And because he knew his friends would not be done for at least, 15 or 20 minutes or so, he just pulled out his phone and began kind of scrolling through social media and, doing what we all do on our phones. But eventually, Sanjay opened up his photo album to look at all the photos he had taken during the hike in, and then also that picture in the pool, and then also some pictures he took inside of the temple. And so he pulls up his pictures and just kind of starts scrolling through them, and he eventually reaches the photo that he took, selfie style, in the pool with all of his friends together. And so he opens that picture up and he looks at it and he smiles because it definitely was the best picture he took. He got all his buddies in frame. Everybody seemed so happy. But as Sanjay was looking at this photo, he realized there was something odd about it. There was just something in this photo that just seemed like it shouldn't be. And as he looked more closely at it, the smile on his face faded and he began to panic just a little bit. He didn't know if what he was looking at was real or not, but he knew he had to go find out. And so Sanjay put his phone away and he looked up and began looking around outside the temple at all the other people who had left, and many of them included his friends. And they were walking around, talking in groups or whatever. And Sanjay, he began looking at all of his friends and he would stare at their faces. He was looking for something, but he didn't see what he was looking for. And so after scanning the entire outside and not feeling satisfied, Sanjay got up and speed walked back into the temple and began going into each and every room, looking at every single person he encountered. And when he would find one of his friends, he would stare at their face. And when he didn't find what he was looking for, he just kept on going to every single room until finally he reached the last room of the temple and he found the last of his friends and he looked at their faces and still he did not see what he was looking for. And so now Sanjay is truly panicked. He's actually horrified at this point. He runs back outside and he finds their college professor who had come along to sort of chaperone the trip. And he ran up to this professor and he pulled out his phone. He opened up that photo of them in the pool and he showed the professor what he had found. And Sanjay pointed out the strange thing about this photo. And so the professor, he began looking at the photo too, and right away, he also could see this very strange thing that seemed very out of place. And so the professor asked Sanjay a few follow-up questions, about like what Sanjay had done since discovering this. And after Sanjay said, I've been all over the temple, I still can't figure it out. And so the professor knew the police would have to get involved. And so the professor got in touch with police, and so the police came out to the temple not long after that. And the students, so Sanjay and all of his friends, had been instructed to stay right by the temple. Do not go down to the pool, stay up here, let the police handle it. And so when the police came in, they came running by the group, and Sanjay and his friends were just kind of watching anxiously, waiting to see what happens. And then as the officers went down to the pool, from where Sanjay and his friends were standing, they actually did not have a clear view. The temple itself blocked their view, so they could not see the pool, but they could hear what the officers were doing. And at first, as Sanjay and his friends are standing there really nervously, they don't hear anything down at the pool. But then they hear one of the officers shout something out, like he's found something. And then Sanjay and his friends heard all this splashing as clearly officers were jumping into the pool. And it was at this moment when Sanjay heard that splashing that he knew the thing he saw in this photo, it had to be real. As horrible as that was, it had to be real. The reason why Sanjay's friend Vishwas was not in the water with everybody else, why he was up reading that plaque about the history of this pool, was because Vishwas did not know how to swim, but he didn't tell anyone. Nobody knew this. And so he was probably kind of embarrassed about it. And so maybe he was reading this plaque as sort of a way to, act distracted, like the plaque is the reason he's not swimming. But then when Sanjay, who meant no harm by this, but he yelled out to Vishwas, "Hey, come on, dude, get in here. Come swimming with us." Because he did it so publicly in front of all the other friends, it seems like Vishwas felt very pressured into getting into the water. And that's what he did. Instead of telling anybody that he could not swim, he just kind of shrugged, took off his shirt, pulled his phone out of his pocket, put it on the ground, and waded into the water. And as soon as he did, the entire group just kind of went back to goofing around and splashing and being totally chaotic. And then when Sanjay was like, "Hey, let's take that photo," he really did manage to get all of his friends in frame somehow, except one of them was Vishwas, and you can only see the top of his head. It's because he was drowning in the background of that photo, just nobody knew it. And so obviously an hour later, when Sanjay's looking at this photo, he sees the top of Vishwas's head and he's like, wait a minute, is he goofing around or is he drowning? And then he ran all around the temple looking for Vishwas. He wanted to prove that he was not in the pool still, that he was up here. But then after searching the entire area and not finding Vishwas, he went to his professor, they called the police, and the discovery was made. And unfortunately, by the time police pulled Vishwas out of the water, he was already deceased. Late on the morning of June 27th, 1957, a 25-year-old Austrian mountain climber named Kurt Diemberger plunged his ice axe into the deep snow ahead of him and then used the axe to pull himself up and over a big ice clump. Kurt was totally physically and mentally exhausted by this point and only wanted to stop for like 2 seconds just to catch his breath. But he knew that was just not an option. Kurt and his climbing partner, a 32-year-old man named Herman Buell, were climbing one of the tallest mountains in the world, called Chogolisa, which is located in northern Pakistan. And they were doing this climb all alone. It was just those two, and they had virtually no safety equipment. Now, for reference, this was not normal. Anybody who climbed Chogolisa did so with Sherpas and guides and oxygen masks. I mean, this was a dangerous climb, and so serious measures had to be taken to ensure it was safe. But Kurt and Herman felt like, nah, that takes all the fun out of mountain climbing. There has to be, like real risk here for this to be worth doing. And also, critically, Kurt and Herman were well aware of the fact that if they successfully climbed Chogalisa with no safety equipment, so what they were planning to do, that would be a new world record because nobody had ever done that before on this mountain. And so that felt like a really cool reason to go for this. And when they began their journey a few days earlier, when they began the climb, it had still felt like a great idea because the weather forecast was perfect for the rest of the time they expected to be on the mountain. However, earlier that morning, Kurt had turned around to talk to Herman, and he noticed off to the south was a kind of ominous dark cloud making its way toward them. Now, obviously, when you're on the ground and you look up and you see a dark cloud, you think, okay, it might storm, or it's actively storming. Maybe it's rain, maybe it's snow, but it's probably not a big deal unless it's like a tsunami or a hurricane or something, but dark clouds are just not really a big deal. But when you are 4 miles up one of the most treacherous mountains in the world, you got no other people with you, you got no safety equipment, and you see a dark cloud coming your way, yeah, that's terrifying. Because storms have been killing mountain climbers basically for as long as mountain climbing has been a thing. And so when Kurt and Herman saw this cloud, even though the weather forecast had been good, they knew that there was a real chance a storm was going to hit them before they reached the summit. And so they had to make a choice. Abort the mission now, go back to camp, and potentially give up on this climb altogether, thereby not getting the world record. Or they could risk it and just try to speed their way up to the summit before the storm arrived. And because Kurt and Herman were actually within about 1,000 feet to the summit when Kurt noticed this dark cloud, they decided, you know what, let's just risk it. We can get up there to the summit, get this thing done before this cloud ever gets to us. And so that was the decision they made. And it was also why Kurt and Herman knew there was no way they could slow down even for a second, because basically this was a sprint to the top. And if they slowed down, they might die. And so, panting and exhausted with the wind whipping up like mad, Kurt and Herman just kept moving up that mountain as fast as they possibly could. But when they got about maybe 500 feet away from the summit, so they're really close at this point, something changed. As Kurt was about to bring his axe back down into the snow to, pull himself up one more step, he suddenly realized he couldn't see the mountain in front of him. Like there was nothing. It was just pure white all around him. He couldn't even see the sky. It was like he was just in this void all of a sudden. And the reason for this is because that dark cloud had caught up to them. They were literally inside of the cloud. That's why they couldn't see anything. And so from behind Kurt, even though he can't see anything, he could hear Herman desperately screaming up to him, "Hey, we got to turn around right now." And Kurt obviously knew, yeah, it's too late. We are not going to make the summit. We got to go. Kurt knew Herman was right. I mean, this is an absolute crisis. If the storm that's basically brewing all around them didn't kill them, certainly the result of the storm would. I mean, all the snow that's going to land is going to fill in their tracks, and it would be nearly impossible to find your way back down again. And so this was like, we totally miscalculated, turn around and get out of here as fast as possible. And so that's what Kurt and Herman began to do. As fast as they could, they began going down the mountain, following along their tracks they had left on the way up. And pretty quickly, Kurt and Herman began making serious progress. And so Kurt was starting to feel optimistic that, maybe they had managed to escape this just in time. But right at that moment, the ground underneath Kurt began to vibrate. Then Kurt looked down, and even though his visibility was basically nothing, he could tell from his legs that the ground was basically shifting underneath him. And then suddenly Kurt felt this feeling that you get when you're on like a carnival ride and you're dropped, that feeling in your stomach that you're falling. He got that because the ground underneath him just gave way. It was an avalanche. And so in absolute desperation, Kurt, who knows he's about to be sucked into an avalanche, he just jumped like as far away from the mountain as he possibly could, kind of at an angle to the right, like he was leaping up and out of the avalanche and over to the right. But you got to remember, he's on this really steep slope. This is not like jumping on flat ground where you jump up and just return to where you jumped from. He's on a slope. So when he jumped out and to the right, it was like he was jumping off a building. He fell something like 30 or so feet before he hit the ground again. But when Kurt hit the ground, he kind of expected to be gobbled up by the snow and keep being sucked down the mountain, but he wasn't. He hit the ground and didn't move. And then he kind of sat up and he looked around and he realized he had successfully jumped out of the avalanche. He had done it. He saved himself. And so he began looking around. The visibility is still terrible, but it's a little bit better because now the avalanche has basically gone down the mountain. The storm is kind of passing, and so the visibility is decent. And, Kurt, he's looking around, screaming out for Herman. He doesn't see him. And then it's like suddenly the visibility just opened up, and Kurt was able to look to his left where the avalanche had gone. And as he was looking, he saw what looked impossible. Basically, the land where they had been walking down this mountain was gone. It was like the avalanche had removed that part of the mountain. And so Kurt is basically laying in the snow on the edge of a new cliff where the avalanche had basically broken away the mountain. And so he's looking into this crevasse where the avalanche went and thinking, I can't believe how lucky I am, but I gotta go find Herman. And so Kurt stands up, and he's pretty battered from this 30-foot fall, but he's got adrenaline pumping through him, so he feels pretty good. And he scrambles his way 30 feet back up the mountain to this ridgeline where he originally jumped out of the avalanche, hoping when he got up there that he might find some sign of where Herman went to, because they were pretty close together when the avalanche started. But when he got up there was no sign of Herman, and he turned around and looked back down the mountain, and he couldn't see Herman anywhere. But when he turned back around, looking now back up the mountain, so in the direction of where they had originally intended to hike, and then where they had to come back down from when they were in the cloud, he noticed that he could see very easily their tracks, he and Herman's tracks. And so with his eyes, he just kind of tracked these tracks all the way down the mountain to where he was. And as he did this, he noticed something. At first, it was like his brain couldn't compute what he was seeing. But after a moment, he knew. Here is a photo of what Kurt would have seen. However, keep in mind, this was not a photo Kurt took, and it's also from a slightly farther away perspective. But conceptually, this really is what Kurt saw that told him what happened to Herman. So in this photo, you can see the mountain and the summits at the top, and there's a trail that goes straight down and then appears to diverge, where there's tracks that go to the left from our perspective, the viewer's perspective. They go to the left around that cliff line, and the other set of footprints that disappear off the cliff. Well, if you haven't figured it out yet, the footprints that go to the left are Kurt's footprints. He just magically jumped and landed on the absolute edge of where this avalanche was going to happen, and Herman is the other set of prints. And so when that avalanche started, there was nowhere for Herman to go, and he was sucked into that avalanche and dragged over 1,000 feet down the mountain, and his body was never recovered. Hey everybody! Maritime history is full of unexplained phenomenon and tall tales of sea monsters and, mariners going out and returning in different parts of the world and not knowing how they got there. You've abandoned ships. You have all these crazy things that happen out on the ocean. And many of them are just stories. We like to believe them because they're fascinating, but few of them actually hold up and are true. But one story, it is absolutely as fascinating as some of these very tall tales, but also happens to be true. Today, I'm going to cover that story, and it is the story of the lost Hawaiian fisherman. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have 5 highly experienced Hawaiian fishermen that take off on a daytime fishing trip. The weather turns really bad while they're out in the water, and they don't return. Despite an extensive search effort, they are not located, and after a year, the families and friends of the lost fishermen, they host a memorial service and assume that their loved ones are gone forever. 9 years later, they make a discovery on a very small island 2,300 miles away that calls into question the entire story. It's an amazing story, it's a tragic story, but it's one worth listening to right to the very end. Before we get started, if you are into strange and mysterious stories like the one I've just described, my channel is going to be a bevy of content just like that. And so if you could gently liquidate, I can't even say it. If you could gently liquidate the like button, if you could gently liquidate the like button and subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. Scott Moorman was born in 1952 in the San Fernando Valley in California. At a young age, he loved the show Adventures in Paradise, which was about this crew of young sailors that would travel the South Pacific looking for adventure and passengers to pick up along the way. And it was just this brilliant show to him, and he became obsessed with living in the South Pacific when he got older. Specifically, he wanted to live in Hawaii. But that wouldn't necessarily happen right away, because at a young age, he got married and had a son and stayed in California. But in 1975, he and his wife split up. And so he took that as an opportunity to go fulfill that childhood dream of living in Hawaii. And so he, on his own, his son stayed with his former wife. He, Scott, moves out to the east coast of Maui on Hawaii. And he moves into this little town called Nahiku. Now, Nahiku was full of lots of native Hawaiians and a growing population of kind of like refugees in a way, Vietnam veterans kind of that were over living in the mainland. You have hippies and kind of earth-loving people that do a lot more partying than working. They were all kind of congregating in this same town. And Scott, he loved that culture and he quickly became a part of it. But he also, unlike a lot of the kind of hippies that made their way to Nahiku, that were part of that growing population, Scott really wanted to kind of become a part of the whole culture of Nahiku, because he growing up, he loved Hawaii. He didn't want to be the others on the island. He wanted to be a part of the main culture. And so he took it upon himself to learn the sort of pidgin English that locals would use. He took time to learn some of the cultural traditions that they had, and really went out of his way to try to befriend some of the locals. And while he wasn't really embraced as, a kind of local, he did form a number of friendships with local Hawaiians, and in time he really felt like this is where he belongs. This was home to him 100%. So he would only go back to California one time. He goes back once for his son's birthday, and he also sees his parents while he's there, and they are all pleading with him to come back, be with your family. They want him to stay. And he says, no, Nahiku is where I belong, and I can't envision myself living anywhere else. And so when he flies back after that one visit to California for his son's birthday, when he flies back to Nahiku, that would be the last time that his son, his former wife, and his parents, his family back in the mainland would see him. That's the last they would see him. On February 11th, 1979, Scott and four of his friends decide that they're not going to go to work that day. They all worked construction together. Instead, they're going to go fishing because they all love to fish and the weather was beautiful, so they said, why not? Now, none of them owned their own boat, so they had to ask a friend who had a 17-foot Boston whaler named the Sarah Joe. Their friend allowed them to use it, and so they got their boat, they went to the store, got some beer, snacks, and got some ice for their big ice chest so they could pack it with the fish they caught, that they hopefully caught, and they were on their way. The part of Hawaii that Scott and his friends lived in, the east coast of Maui, at the time did not get any TV stations, and radio broadcasts were done maybe once a week and were hard to pick up. So people in that area, especially fishermen and anybody that was out on the water, they were accustomed to going out without a weather report. They basically played the weather by their eye. They kind of just sized it up and said, does it seem okay? Okay, it seems good, and they would go out. Obviously that's pretty risky, but the locals were pretty good at it, and Scott and his buddies also were very good at this point at kind of reading the weather, and so they thought this day was going to be just fine. Now, in order to get to the place where they intended to fish, they would need to pass through something called the Alanui-Haha Channel, which is considered to be one of the roughest and most dangerous areas for all sailors anywhere near Hawaii. So it's a dangerous place. It's at certain points, it is almost 7,000 feet deep. There's very strong surface currents. It's just a risky place to be if, for example, there was a big storm. Now, when Scott and the Sarah Joe crew took off, the water was calm, the weather was beautiful, and by about 10 a.m., when they believed they must have been in the channel at this point, the weather was still very calm. However, a low pressure system had picked up very suddenly between 10 and noon, and so when they probably were somewhere towards the end of the channel when they were going to be making their way into open water to fish, there was beginning to be torrential downpour all along the channel, and it eventually turned into a full-scale hurricane. So on the island, people described this particular storm as being one of the worst they've seen in 50 plus years. This is like a sudden, freak, horrible storm. Of the boats that took off to go fishing out of this East Coast section of Maui, there was 4 fishing boats that went out. 3 returned. The one that didn't was, of course, the Sarah Joe. At 5 p.m., the Coast Guard is notified by their friends and family that they have not returned yet. The storm is still raging, gale force winds, torrential downpour, but they still send out a plane to look overhead. A number of crews were sent out to go look for them, even with the incredible risk of searching in this weather. But considering the dangers they were in, they decided it was necessary. The searchers who were in the boats, the boat crews that were sent out to look for the Sarah Joe crew, they said that at best they could see maybe 50 feet in front of them, and even that was a stretch. So it was a limited search, but they did go out on the day of the storm. Over the next 5 days, the Coast Guard led a search that included 44 planes and boats covering a 56,000 square mile search block for the Sarah Joe, but nothing was found. There was absolutely no trace of them, and so after 5 days, unfortunately, the Coast Guard called off the search. However, the people in their hometown in Nahiku, they knew these 5 men. These were incredibly capable, very experienced fishermen. They were all great swimmers. They believed that because they hadn't found a trace of them, that perhaps they were still alive out there. And so they, as a community, raised $50,000 to pay private ships and planes to continue the search. So there was an extended search that went on for a couple more weeks that covered an even bigger swath of territory, but at the end still yielded no results. The people that were doing the searching were just baffled, because when people go missing at sea, there's some indication a lot of times when they're just fishing basically right off the coast, there's some indication of what happened to them. It's rare that you would have 0% found. Absolutely no idea what happened to these 5 fishermen. 1 year after their disappearance, the families and friends decide to host a memorial and mourn the loss officially for their loved ones. It was believed at this point that they had all perished. 2,300 miles southwest of the Hawaiian Islands lies this tiny little stretch of, I guess you can call them islands, called the Taongi Atoll. And these little tiny strips of land that were barely higher than sea level barely sustained any life. There was a couple scrub plants that took hold here and there, but there's no fresh water. The only recorded human life that's ever been there was during World War II. A number of Japanese soldiers were stranded there briefly, but it is 200 miles from the nearest inhabited land. It's very far from any major shipping lane. It's just a place that, as a human being, you don't want to go. In fact, it was actually considered, when they were testing the atomic bomb, when the United States was, it was considered to be a great spot to test the atomic bomb because no one's there and no one's anywhere near it. So incredibly isolated. On September 10th, 1988, marine biologist John Naughton, along with 4 other crew members, descended upon the Taongi Atoll. They were sent there by the Marshall Islands to find a suitable wildlife sanctuary for some sea turtles and seabirds. Within 30 minutes of arriving at the atoll, John and his crew saw what looked like a skeleton of a boat, a Boston whaler boat that was down on the shore. John was actually a resident of Maui, so he's from Hawaii, and he saw on the back of this kind of skeletal remains of this boat the letters HA, which means it's registered in Hawaii. And so he's intrigued because we're 2,300 miles from Hawaii, and he starts moving the sand away to get a better look to see if there's any more writing on the boat. And he makes out a couple of letters, an S, an R, an H, an O, an E, and he puts it together. He's like, this is the Sarah Joe. This is the boat that went missing 9 years earlier. And the reason he knew it that quickly is because he was one of the people deeply involved in the search efforts to find these lost fishermen. He was like leading search groups. He was totally committed to finding them. And here he is in a crazy twist of fate, 2,300 miles away, almost a decade later, finding the boat. Now, the boat did not initially provide any sort of information about where the fishermen might be. There was nothing on it. It was just the wood, very degraded from water, wear and tear. But the crew decided that they would search the island and just kind of look around, because perhaps the crew, even if it was years and years ago, maybe they landed here and then they ultimately perished once they were here. So maybe we can find their remains or just some sign that they might have been here. John walks about 100 yards away from the Sarajevo and he sees what looks like kind of a crudely constructed cross out of driftwood. And below it, he can see that there's a bunch of rocks that have been placed definitely in some sort of decorative way, and it looks like a gravesite. And considering what they're looking for, he thinks there's the first of the bodies that we're going to find. He calls over his crew, and so they begin kind of moving some things aside. They don't want to totally disturb the grave, just to be respectful. But a little ways down, the inside of the grave is not only bones, but they find this little book. The book had no writing in it, and it's hard to even call it a book. It was more like a stack of papers. But on each page, there was a little square cutout of tinfoil that sat on the page. Basically, every page had a little square of tinfoil and nothing else to it. No one knew what it meant, but undoubtedly, somebody had very clearly buried somebody else right here in a very shallow grave and had left this little book in here with whoever was buried here. And so while John and a couple of his crew are looking at this book and trying to make sense of it, one of his crew members that was just kind of standing back looking at the site commented that, you know, the bones that are in that grave, they're not very bleached. Now, if a bone's been sitting for a long time, it will basically bleach and become totally white. Everything comes off the bone. These bones looked relatively fresh. So whoever was buried here, they had been buried recently. At this point, John and his crew have basically abandoned their kind of wildlife sanctuary research, and now they're just scouring this little scrub of land in the Taongi Atoll for any other signs of, you know, things that could have to do with the Sarajevo crew, and they found nothing else. So they report back to the Coast Guard and alert the Marshallese authorities that what was found on the island, and they send out a couple of forensic experts to examine the bone. They were able to determine that the bones in the grave belonged to Scott Mormon. When news got back to the Hawaiian mainland that Scott Mormon had been found, the family members of the other 4 fishermen that went missing on the Sarajevo, they hired private detectives to go scour the Taongi Atoll, look everywhere, see if you can find our loved ones' remains. And so this team of private detectives and a dive team and all these people are sent to the Taongi Atoll, and they look everywhere. They're digging up the sand. They have dive teams going out into the water. I mean, they are really leaving no stone unturned. And all they're able to find is the outboard motor of the Sarajevo, which was a little ways off the coast from where the boat itself was found, wedged in some coral. And then they also found a handful of more bones on the beach near where that shallow grave where Scott Mormon was buried, but those bones also belong to Scott Mormon. So there was nothing else found of the other 4 fishermen or any indication of what happened to the boat. There's nothing. And in fact, researchers that were able to look at the bones of Scott Mormon, there wasn't enough evidence there to help them determine a cause of death. So we don't even know how he passed away or when he passed away. However, it was determined just based on the bleaching of the bones that it was a relatively recent death. I don't know what the timeline is on that, but recent is the term that's used. While it was a very big deal that they located Scott Mormon's remains on the Taongi Atoll, even though it was 10 years later, this is revelatory. This is a really big deal, not only for the families of the fishermen, but for anybody involved. This is a really big deal. But there was an additional revelation once Scott Mormon's bones were found that basically turned this case upside down. There's already a bunch of questions like, who buried Scott Mormon? How did Scott Mormon become freshly buried almost a decade later? You know, how long had they been there? There's some basic questions that you're going to ask. But there's one fact that nobody seems to be able to reconcile, and that was 6 years after they went missing, the Marshall Islands conducted a government survey of the Taongi Atoll, which would mean they scoured the islands, all those little strips of land that make up the Taongi Atoll. They scoured it just taking measurements and basically mapping out the Taongi Atoll. I think it was in preparation for potentially turning it into this wildlife sanctuary. So they looked everywhere on the Taongi Atoll 6 years after the Sarah Joe went missing. So they go missing. 6 years later, there's this government survey of the Taongi Atoll. And guess what? They ended up looking at that survey, and there's no boat, there's no shallow grave, there's nothing. It's just an uninhabited strip of land, nothing else. There's no boats there. Experts, when this was revealed, said that, well, had they, the Sarah Joe, the crew of the Sarah Joe, gone dead in the water following the storm, they could have drifted the 2,300 miles to the Taongi Atoll in roughly 3 months. But they weren't there at the 6-year mark. So what were they doing between the disappearance and the 6-year mark, which would have been the earliest they could have arrived, because prior to, they would have been discovered during this audit. So you have a 6-year gap where no one can account for where they were. Even if they made it to the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day after they had disappeared, that they had been somehow surviving in the open ocean for 6 years, and they just so happened to land at the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day later. Basically, they just after the survey's done, let's say they make it there. Who buried Scott Moorman? And what was the booklet that was buried with him with the tinfoil squares? This is a totally uninhabited stretch of land. There is no one there to perform any sort of burial ritual. Even if we're willing to say that maybe one of the other fishermen buried Scott Moorman, well, then where are the other fishermen? Some people wonder, are they still alive? So like many of my videos, unfortunately, there isn't really a good conclusion here. It just kind of ends in a bunch of questions. But I would love it if you included in the comment section what you think could be the reason behind that 6-year gap. How can we account for those 6 years when they were not at the Taongi Atoll? I mean, my suggestion would be maybe the survey wasn't done very well and they just missed it. But that still doesn't also answer, well, who buried Scott Moorman? And also, why were his bones not so bleached? How did they...
City lights cut through the night. A distant whistle calls the line. One door opens, time stands still. Only a heartbeat left to ride. Still tracks lead beyond the skyline. Winds carry dreams still undefined. World. But the wonders do when they walk through the wild. Sing melodies to the ground. Home, walking home. While the wind blows soft, they whistle a tune, returning their roots and their seed. Home, home, coming home. And who heard the flutes are all alone? Its crown is only seen by coyotes and nightingales and peptide chains. Its face is only seen by angels and aphids. Its hands are only felt by sharks who kiss something very like skin. The sun doesn't close her eyes because eyes cannot lie. Baby, baby, you let me down. My eyes are still bleeding from the 2 sunsets I had to capture on my phone. The eye of the beholder does not reflect the truth. The sun doesn't set until it sets for you.
How did he come to be freshly buried 9.5 years after he disappeared? So lots of questions. I would love to hear your theories, your comments, your takeaways. in the comments section. And again, if you liked this video, please hit like, please click subscribe, turn on all notifications, because I'm going to be posting stories like this one 3-4 times a week. I love doing this, and I hope you'll come along. If you want to follow me on other social media channels, my handle on Instagram is JohnBallen416, and I am MrBallen, one word, on every other social media platform. I post quite a bit on TikTok.